Thanks very much, Jason. We at the Bipartisan, as Jason indicated, we at the Bipartisan Policy Center have always considered preventing a nuclear Iran to be the most pressing national U.S. The most pressing U.S. national security challenge. As President Obama recently said, preventing a nuclear Iran is profoundly in the security interests of the United States, hence today's panel. And I would say it's a really excellent panel that I think we put together. I'll just introduce them quickly. Moderator Steve Rademaker, on his left, is a principal at the Podesta Group. He served as Assistant Secretary of State from 2002 to 2006, heading various bureaus at the State Department, including the Bureau of Arms Control and the Bureau of International Security and Nonproliferation. Steve has been also an active member of our Iran task force for the last 4.5 years.
Well, we now are just a short period away from the May 23rd talks, and I'd like to address this both to Nick and Steve. How would you define a successful outcome from those talks? What do you think we need? And is the only way that we can imagine a successful outcome if there is a credible threat of a military response to Iran?
A lot of analysts have commented that this moment appears perhaps more ripe for a deal than at any time in recent years. And Nick touched on some of the reasons for that. Iran is under significant economic pressure as a result of international sanctions, both what the Europeans are doing, but also what the United States is doing pursuant to legislation passed by Congress late last year to target transactions with the Central Bank of Iran. The Israeli military threat, I agree with Nick, it has been deployed in a credible manner. And this has certainly focused the attention of the Iranians, in my opinion. I think it's also had effects on the other parties to the negotiations. I don't think, as Nick said, I don't think the Chinese would want to admit it, but they have pretty serious energy security concerns. They do not want to see a military conflict in the Persian Gulf. I think, and this actually is one of my concerns, I think the Obama administration as well has pretty serious economic concerns with a pending presidential election. I think for the Obama administration, the threat of a military attack by Israel right now is deeply troubling. And one of my worries is that I'm very happy for the Iranians to come to the table highly motivated to reach a deal. I don't want the United States to be too highly motivated to reach a deal, because that could lead to compromises that ultimately would not serve our national interests. In answer to the question, what would be an acceptable outcome, I think we have to keep our focus on Iran's uranium enrichment program, which has always been the crown jewel of their nuclear weapons program. And any deal that permits them to continue enrichment, I think, is a bad deal for the United States. And what they've done over the last 3 years of the Obama administration is just as President Obama ratcheted up pressure by trying to apply tougher sanctions starting in about 2010, the Iranians decided to ratchet up pressure on the international community by stepping up their enrichment program and enriching to a higher level, getting themselves closer to nuclear weapons capability. And in a way, it's a race between, I'd say what you see between the United States and Iran is a race between heightened economic sanctions on the one hand and heightened enrichment activity on the other. And who is gaining more leverage over the other with this competition? I worry that you do hear voices that say, well, at this point, the 20% enrichment program has to be our focus. Let's stop paying attention to the 3.5% enrichment program, which was always the centerpiece of their program. I think that kind of advice is really very dangerous.
Comment on that, and also take into account the fact that there's now a new coalition in Israel that has just been formed, and how does that affect the credibility, shall we say, of what Israel is about? And Steve?
Well, if I could just comment on the question of how patient we should be in the negotiating process with Iran. I think it's important to recall that 15 months ago was the last time the two sides met. And at that time, Iran came to the meeting and essentially said, end all your sanctions on us, and then we will be prepared to talk about our nuclear program. So it was essentially a non-serious. I mean, it was like you unilaterally disarm, and then perhaps we'll talk about what you're concerned about. 15 months later, they want to have a more serious negotiation. What has changed? Well, they're under substantially more pressure. That's what's changed. They're under additional economic pressure, and they're under additional military pressure, and that has changed their calculation. They want relief from that pressure. Maybe the way they want to get relief is by negotiating a deal, but it could well be that they simply want to use the process of negotiations to break the momentum and slow down and all of the developments that have led them to reassess their approach over the last 15 months. And that cannot be in our interest, to let them succeed in simply using a diplomatic process to break the momentum of the pressure that we've successfully brought to bear against them.
So on the general theory that experience is what enables you to recognize a mistake when you do it again, what mistakes should we avoid if we're trying to get an agreement with Iran? And what can we do now in a very short run? Because you have, as we all know, a much shorter fuse in the Israeli public policy than you have in the American policy.
To reiterate what I said earlier, I think we need to keep our eye on Iran's enrichment program. We have to get a handle on that program. And we need to insist on full implementation of the Security Council resolutions, which require suspension not just of the 20% enrichment program, but the other 3.5% enrichment program.
And how do we enforce that? How do we enforce that?
Well, you were asking,
Right.
what should we do in the negotiation? That should be our baseline.
Right.
How do we enforce that? Well, we keep bringing pressure to bear, and I think this is the additional point I wanted to make about our strategy in the meantime. If you think about it the way I outlined it, for whatever the duration of these negotiations, Iran is not going to stand down. They are going to keep enriching both to the 3.5% level and to the 20% level as fast as they possibly can, and they're going to be deploying additional centrifuges and moving full speed ahead because they know that increases the pressure on us. If this negotiation process is going to become attenuated at all, we need to do the same thing. We need to continue ratcheting up our pressure throughout the process. Now, history says to me that's unlikely, because history says to me that every time our diplomats get into a negotiating process, they say, oh, no. It would send a wrong signal here. It would be disastrous to the prospects for negotiation for us to do anything provocative, so let's stand down on additional sanctions measures. And even if the United States doesn't do that, I worry that the Europeans will tend to do that, and even more so the Chinese, the Russians, and others. So we cannot allow that to happen. If Iran is going to continue enriching during this process, we have to continue ratcheting up the sanctions. Otherwise, we're in a losing scenario here.
But there is a general sense, it seems to me, particularly in Europe, that the United States is not about to engage in a military effort to contain Iran, like it or not. So the question is, how does the United States, in one curious way, considering its military power, how does it attach that power to a sense of will and a decisiveness to use this within the appropriate framework? Because there also has to be some degree of, shall we say, confidence on the Israeli part that the United States will do it. Otherwise, they will lose their opportunity to do it because of the so-called zone of immunity.
Yeah. I was just going to quickly comment. I think it's all well and good to say that Israel shouldn't attack, the United States should. But my personal view is that there's virtually no chance the United States will mount a military effort between now and the U.S. presidential election. But more importantly, I think the Iranians believe there's zero chance of that between now and the presidential election. So I'm afraid that that message, as understood in Iran, is basically the military pressure is off for the near term, because the Americans won't let the Israelis do it, and the Americans aren't going to do it themselves either.
My judgment. When you said that the Iranians might put something that was attractive to some elements of the P5+1, what would that, just speculate, and it is just speculation, obviously, what might that be? And the second part of the question is, what would they have to put on the table for you to say, wow, they're really interested this time? This is for the whole panel.
The history here is, I think, instructive. Iran resumed construction on the Bushehr nuclear power reactor in 1995, and for the next 10 years, it was the policy of the United States that a civil nuclear program like that in Iran was unacceptable. There was a danger to the region. And about 2005, well, in 2002, the enrichment program at Natanz was revealed, and our attention immediately shifted from the civil nuclear power plant to the enrichment facility. And along about 2005, we reached the judgment that, we were basically the Bushehr plant was almost done. Essentially, it was too late. So we essentially signed off as a government. We said, okay, we back down. We are now prepared to accept a civil nuclear reactor at Bushehr, and our focus is exclusively on your enrichment activity. And since 2002, that has been our focus. And as reflected in 6 Security Council resolutions, we have demanded that they suspend enrichment. The Iranians, by contrast, since 2002, have had one objective, and that is to gain international acceptance of their enrichment program. And I think they believe that time is on their side. They believe that just as after 10 years we back down on the question of the Bushehr civil nuclear reactor, 10 years have now gone by on enrichment, and they're expecting us to back down on enrichment. Maybe, I think a trade where they back off on the 20% and we accept the 3.5% enrichment, which has been the nub of the dispute for the last 10 years, that would be a huge victory for the Iranians. I think that's what they're shooting for. And I'm troubled every time I read some expert commentator saying that's as good a deal as we're going to get, let's take it. We will see how these negotiations play out. But the zone of immunity, is clearly a motivator. I worry that's a motivator for the Obama administration. They don't want the Israelis to strike. And a deal on the 20% that ostensibly addresses Israeli concerns about the zone of immunity, but allows the 3.5% enrichment to continue unimpeded. I'm sure that if that happens, it won't be presented to the world as the final deal. It'll be presented as some sort of interim step that is laying the groundwork for further diplomatic progress. But for all the reasons that it might be a good deal when it's accepted by the international community, I don't know what would change in 6 months or a year. And at every step in the process, we would confront the question of, well, if we let this process break down, they're going to resume the 20% enrichment. They're going to go back into this zone of immunity. So we can't allow that to happen. We have to keep this process alive. And that, I think, in the real world translates to the interim deal becoming the permanent deal. And Iran essentially achieving what it's been seeking to achieve since 2002, which is international acceptance, if not explicitly, then at least implicitly, of their uranium enrichment program.